Hello, everybody. You're currently watching a video presentation of my psychology project. My name is Jason, and I'll be walking you through my presentation. So, the essay title I chose is Does Exposure to Media Violence Increase an Individual's Likelihood of Engaging in Violent Behavior? In relevance to this topic, I've chosen the article which is The Effects of Violent Video Game Habits on Adolescent Hostility, Aggressive Behaviors, and School Performance. So, what is the reason for this experiment? Some studies may be outdated in environments that are continually evolving in terms of violent content. With this in mind, it is likely that studies carried out 10 to 15 years ago on the effects of violent video games underestimate the effects of modern violent games on children today. Although the existing research provides some support for links between both violent video game content and amount of play with aggressive and academic outcomes, there's a need for additional research. This article is to study the relationship between exposure to violent video games and trait hostility, as well as the relationship between exposure to violent video games and aggression in naturalistic settings. Besides that, this study is conducted to find out whether trait hostility moderates the effects of violent video exposure on aggressive behavior, or does it mediates the effects of violent video exposure on aggressive behavior. It also studies whether the amount of video gameplay is negatively related to academic performance or is not associated with aggressive behaviors. The current research tested four hypotheses regarding video game contents derived from GMM. These include exposure to violent video games is positively correlated with trait hostility, exposure to violent video games is positively correlated with aggression in naturalistic settings, trait hostility moderates the effects of violent video game exposure on aggressive behavior, and trait hostility mediates the effects of violent video game exposure on aggressive behavior. In addition, two hypotheses were tested with respect to amount of video game play. The, the amount of video game play is negatively related to academic performance, and the amount of video game play isn't associated with aggressive behaviors. So who were the participants in this experiment? 607 8th grade and 9th grade students participate in the study. They were recruited from four Midwestern schools, including one urban private school, two suburban public schools, and one rural public schools. These students were recruited from mandatory classes within their schools. The experiment was conducted in the following way. Firstly, data was collected between 4th of April and 2nd of May 2000. Each participant completed an anonymous survey that gathered descriptive data about student habits, attitudes, and knowledge about video games, as well as school performance, demographic data, and a measure of trait hostility. Classroom teachers were trained to administer the surveys during a one classroom period. The participants were treated in accordance with ethical principles of psychologists and code of conduct. The result shows that hostility was correlated with three measures of violent content, which is the amount of violence adolescents like to have in video games, whether they like more or less violence now compared to 2 or 3 years ago, and the amount of video game violence they expose themselves to. Furthermore, students who play more violent video games are more likely to show aggression, for example, involving in physical fights and get into arguments with teachers more frequently. Not only that, this study showed that in the long term, Hostility mediates the effects of both amount of play and violence exposure on grades and aggressive behaviors. Besides that, the amount of video game play is both directly and indirectly related to grades, while the amount of video game play was indirectly related to arguments with teachers. So the conclusion is all hypotheses were confirmed. Firstly, exposure to violent video games is positively correlated with trait hostility. Not only that, exposure to violent video games is positively correlated with aggression in naturalistic settings. Furthermore, trait hostility mediates the effects of violent video game exposure on aggressive behavior. In addition, the two hypotheses tested regarding video game play was also confirmed. The amount of video game play is negatively related to academic performance, and it is not associated with aggressive behaviors. So, what are the limitations of this experiment? It is important to note that this study is limited by its correlational nature. Inferences about causal direction should be viewed with caution. However, these results suggest that concern about exposure to violent video games is not misplaced. Not only that, this study is also limited by reliance on self-report and by not being able to assess the type of violence. So why did I choose this topic, you say? Well, nowadays, children are more exposed to media violence. For example, television violence, film violence, cartoon violence, and the subject of this topic, video game violence. These had led to increase in aggressive behavior amongst children. Furthermore, video games has become a form of entertainment. It is highly popular amongst children because it is fun and bring excitement to their childhood. However, children tend to play more violent video games as it brings more excitement and satisfaction. This topic, this article, it links video game violence to increased aggressive behavior by researching into how how video game violence has led to increased aggressive behavior, which is quite relevant to the topic I have chosen. Well, this is the end. Thank you for joining me to the end.